But Danielle Smith was doing her debut press conference this week, and she was taking questions on a number of issues. She was talking about the Sovereignty Act first and foremost, which I don't think the media is really going to want to let her off on. But it wasn't until the tail end of the press conference where she got a question about her plan, which I think is a very good one, to put vaccine status in the Alberta Human Rights Code. So it would be illegal under Alberta law to discriminate against people based on their vaccine status. Now, Danielle Smith has been a longtime libertarian. She is an advocate for individual choice. She has been, throughout the course of the pandemic, an incredibly strong voice on vaccine choice. She was when she was on the radio, she has been in her work since, and she was during the campaign. She had a very clear position on this, a very clear proposal. She wasn't just saying, I'm against mandates. She was saying, I have a way that we can codify in law this opposition to mandates. And that was to put this human rights protection in place, which protects your right to be unvaccinated the same way as it protects your right to be free from discrimination as a racial minority based on your religion, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, and all of these other things. And she gave a very good answer, which has gotten now millions of views online. When asked about this,
I have a question about vaccine choice and how you want to protect that under the Human Rights Act. I'm wondering how vaccine choice, how you see that as equal to something like race, gender, sexuality, which we protect because those are not about choices.
Well, I guess the way I look at it is that the community that faced the most restrictions on their freedoms in the last year were those who made a choice not to be vaccinated. I don't think I've ever experienced a situation in my lifetime where a person was fired from their job or not allowed to watch their kids play hockey or not allowed to go visit a loved one in long-term care or hospital or not allowed to go get on a plane to either go across the country to see family or even travel across the border. So they have been the most discriminated against group that I've ever witnessed in my lifetime. That's a pretty extreme level of discrimination that we have seen. I don't take away any of the discrimination that I've seen in those other groups that you mentioned, but this has been an extraordinary time in the last year in particular. And I want people to know that I find that unacceptable, that we are not going to create a segregated society on the basis of a medical choice.
The part that has a lot of people on the left just exploding their own minds, spontaneously combusting, is Danielle Smith saying that the unvaccinated are the most discriminated against group she's ever seen in her lifetime. Now, she was born in the early 70s. I don't know exactly how old she is, but nevertheless, she says that the unvaccinated in her lifetime are the most discriminated against group. And on the surface, this does not sound like an inherently illogical thing to say. In the last 2 years, certainly, the unvaccinated have been, not just as a matter of discrimination and bigotry they experience in society, but as a matter of systemic government-imposed policy discrimination, barred from working in the civil service, they've lost their jobs, they were banned from taking planes, they were forced into quarantine, banned from trains. The amount of discrimination that has been heaped on the unvaccinated, not just by bigoted individuals, but by the state, is monumental. At the same time, I also don't want to get into this comparison game. When you make a comment like, no one else has ever had that discrimination, which is not what she said, but when you make that comment that it's worse than anything else, people start throwing their own understandable grievances there. For example, in Danielle Smith's lifetime, there were still residential schools. In Danielle Smith's lifetime, gay marriage did not exist with the force of law for much of it, and so on. But I don't like the comparison for a number of reasons, because I think all discrimination is wrong on its surface, on an individual basis. You don't need to compare and shouldn't need to compare one person's discrimination against another. And it's doing that always rubs me the wrong way, because people try to delegitimize or minimize other people struggling because they think theirs is worse. Whereas I take an equal opportunity approach on this. Let's say that, yes, racial discrimination is bad. So is vaccine discrimination. The whole point of intersectionality, what we were told we're all supposed to move towards, is that we can't just look at these things in isolation, but I think we need to, in a lot of ways, call them out on individual terms and call them out individually when bad things are happening, when discrimination is taking place. And Danielle Smith, in the full context, in the full comment, does, by the way, say that she is not diminishing other discrimination that was raised in the question, such as racial and sexual orientation and so on. She's not talking about diminishing or downplaying that. She's just saying that we need to call out the horrendous discrimination that has been taking place on the grounds of vaccination status. And this is a discrimination for which the federal government in Canada has been unrepentant, for which provincial governments in this country have been unrepentant, and for which no one in Canada, in Canadian politics, who holds elected office, has taken the view that Danielle Smith has just done, which is to say this is wrong and it will never happen, and to do so in a believable way. When she came out and said segregation would not exist in her province, Doug Ford said that in Ontario, that he would not support a segregated society. Danielle Smith's predecessor, Jason Kenney, had at one time taken it off the table. But Danielle Smith knows that history. And Premier Smith, I should say, is well aware of that. When she makes that commitment, I think she understands the weight of what it is she's committing to and what it is that she's promising. And that is that there will not be a lockdown, there will not be segregation, and there will be protection of vaccine choice in Alberta from here on out. And there's a reason that clip has gone so viral, not just across Alberta, not just across Canada, but around the world. I've got American friends, Australian friends, British friends that are sending me this, being like, who is this woman? One person's like, I don't know what Alberta is. I think it's a Canadian thing, but I'm all for it. And that, to me, is exceptional, because right now we are in the midst of a global trend where governments and countries can stand and look at the fork in the road and say we can choose freedom or we can choose not freedom. And most have been choosing not freedom. Most have been choosing to go so far away from this idea of individual freedom. In Australia, as Alexander Marshall, who's a tremendous commentator and writer for The Spectator, pointed out, Australia, even still, we're approaching 3 years since COVID was discovered, and nearly 3 years on, Australia is still in some parts committing to vaccine discrimination. Insane. And it's an island nation. The unvaccinated were the entire country was basically an open-air prison in large terms because of their inability to travel, to leave. But the unvaccinated are still significantly discriminated against, not incidentally, not peripherally, but as a matter of public policy. And this is unacceptable. And I said some weeks ago that there needs to be a reckoning. It's not just enough to lift or suspend restrictions. Governments need to be held to account. They need to be ousted. They need courts to slap them down. And we need politicians that are going to say on behalf of their provinces, their countries, their jurisdictions, that this is not something that we will stand for. And that is precisely what Danielle Smith did. But it isn't just theoretical here. She's talking about changing the Human Rights Act, fine. She's also talking about the why. And this is where I have to look at a bit of a global context right now. And you probably know the clip I'm going to in a few moments' time from the European Parliament. But I want to set the stage because that clip from Danielle Smith, that initial minute I just played, there's another minute where she talks about more of the scientific basis of this. And this is where we actually need to go down the road of explaining a little bit about what the premise was. The premise of vaccine passports, the stated premise, the public one that the government acknowledged, was that it was unsafe for the unvaccinated to congregate in a restaurant, in a sports venue, in a music venue, etc. It was unsafe to do that because the unvaccinated were going to transmit COVID. And then they were going to get sick, and then they were going to overwhelm the hospital system, and then so and so and so and so would happen, and we would just have this collapse of society. So the premise of the vaccine passport was that you need to be vaccinated and ensure that all the people around you are vaccinated for certain spaces to be safe, whether they were airplanes or restaurants. That was the premise. Community spread needed to be stopped. Vaccination was going to do that. A lot of people got vaccinated not because they personally felt at risk of COVID, but because they wanted to save grandma. The titular grandma at the center of all our COVID policy, they got vaccinated to save her life, not their own. And a lot of people bought into this idea. And I totally understand it. When everyone is saying that vaccines prevent transmission, that's typically been our understanding of a vaccine. I totally get that. So people get vaccinated because they want to stop transmission. We know that has been an absolute farce, especially in the Omicron era, the booster era. The vaccines are not stopping transmission. The benefit of the vaccine that's stated and promoted now is reduced to limiting your personal risk of hospitalization or death, which means it is the epitome of an individual choice. It affects no one else, whether you get vaccinated or you don't get vaccinated.